Good day. The last couple of hours, there's been less information from the Ukrainian battlefront fields, possibly because the heavy snow is making movement more difficult. There are some suggestions, and I want to stress these are purely suggestions, I don't know whether that is true, that the snow is having more of an effect complicating Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut as opposed to the Wagner organization's advance in that town. But I want to stress that's just a report, one stray report I saw. I'm a little surprised about it. I would have thought, on the contrary, that it's attackers who are more likely to be affected by heavy snowdrifts, and including snow within an urban setting. But anyway, for what it's worth, I pass it on. I also saw another report which claimed that General Syrski, the commander of Ukrainian ground troops, has now come and informed President Zelensky that the center of Bakhmut has essentially fallen to the Russians and that the road from Konstantinovka has been cut. I put very low reliance upon this particular report. It seems to me that if the center of Bakhmut had indeed been captured by the Russians in its entirety, we would have had some more concrete reports about that. And since the administrative building lies within the center of Bakhmut, we would presumably have seen photographs of it flying the Russian flag. The one part of this report that might have some weight is the one about the road from Konstantinovka having been cut. To be very clear, I don't think that is the case, but I did see reports yesterday, which I think are rather more reliable, that the Russians have, over the last couple of hours, begun a major assault on the village of Ivanivska near Bakhmut, and that they've been, in the previous days, engaging in very heavy shelling of Ukrainian positions in that particular village. Now, if the Russians do capture Ivanivska, that will undoubtedly cut the southern spur of the road from Konstantinovka. It will not fully cut the northern spur, which passes through a different village, which is, of course, Homovo. However, for some time, the Russians have been encamped very close to both spurs of this road, the southern spur that passes through Ivanivska and the northern spur which passes through Homovo. And it's been accepted for some time also that the heavy snowfalls, that the roads are unusable by heavy traffic, by heavy Ukrainian traffic, by convoys of lorries and such things, because they can now be easily shelled or targeted by Russian artillery, including mortars and anti-tank missiles. I would add that the heavy snowfalls, I would have thought, will have further complicated problems of resupply of the Ukrainian troops within Bakhmut itself. It will have made use of the fields and the country roads even harder than it has been up to now, and that may continue for some time. And of course, when the snow starts to melt, that will probably cause the mud to get worse again, which might complicate Ukrainian resupply in Bakhmut even further. If it is indeed the case that the Russians are able to progress faster, despite the snow in Bakhmut, than the Ukrainians are able to defend, then I'm going to make a guess it's probably related to supply issues, that the Ukrainians are running short of supplies and can't get more supplies across the fields and the dirt roads, and that's complicating their position, their defences within Bakhmut itself even, even more. Now, there's been a long report about the fighting in Bakhmut and in areas round about in The Guardian. It's by a journalist who hasn't obviously got anywhere close to Bakhmut itself, and I don't think it provides much enlightenment about the actual fighting in Bakhmut itself. It's very impressionistic, and the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers that the Guardian journalist has spoken to, are clearly heavily briefed by the Ukrainian military to follow the official line. But there are some things that this article does say which I think are of some interest. Firstly, it reports the fact that there's been criticism of President Zelensky's decision to fight on in Bakhmut, and that this criticism is coming from within Ukraine itself. And it says, this is quoting directly from this article, as the Russian attacks continue, there is concern in some circles that President Zelensky's stubborn insistence on fighting in the city could blunt the offensive potential of Ukraine's army. Ludmila Buymeister, an MP who was formerly part of Zelensky's party in the parliament, and since the start of the war, a special forces commander, called for a tactical retreat in mid-March to preserve Ukrainian lives, and argued a lost battle does not mean a lost war. And there's also some further reports, and this is in the same article, about what might happen after Bakhmut is finally captured by the Russians. And we have this report, this is in the Guardian article. Alexandr, a spokesman for the 24th Brigade, adds that while Bakhmut may be surrounded on three sides, its tall and well-built central buildings, many of which also have extensive basements, make it easier to defend than Chasov Yar, the next village on 8 miles west. It is mostly small houses there, he says, and the village is being heavily bombed. The sound of incoming artillery was clearly audible on Thursday from neighbouring Konstantinovka, a further 7 miles to the southwest. So shelling continues very heavy. Russian shelling continues very heavy in all of these areas. Chasov Yar is being shelled. Ivanivska is being shelled. Bakhmut is also being shelled by the Russians. And a Ukrainian spokesman of a military unit in the area has come forward and said that if Bakhmut falls, it's going to be much more difficult to defend Chasov Yar, the next village to the west. And that argues against the many claims I've been hearing in the past that Bakhmut itself, its capture, is really of little strategic significance because it's going to be easier. There's all sorts easier to hold the positions for Ukraine to the west of Bakhmut because there are stronger defense lines to the west of Bakhmut than Bakhmut itself. On the contrary, this report suggests that Bakhmut is much easier to defend than some of these places further west, Chasov Yar specifically, because of the urban landscape. The large apartment buildings, the domi, the big Soviet-era apartment buildings built to exceptionally high specifications. I've seen them. I've actually stayed in them from time to time. These are extraordinarily large, strong buildings, easy to defend. And as Alexander, the spokesman for the 24th Brigade, says, many of them have basements, extensive basements, and they are natural fortresses Now, the Russians claim that they're capturing these at the rate of 3 to 8 a day. I've no reason to doubt that. Prigozhin, the titular head of the Wagner organization, said the same thing. Again, I've no particular reason to doubt that. But they do provide Ukraine with a solid basis upon which they can defend Bakhmut. The same, by the way, is true in Vuhledar. Now, we also have further reports about the fighting, the mood further west from Bakhmut. Residents from the east side of Konstantinivka, nearest the front line, have already made up their own mind, knowing that despite the determined resistance, Bakhmut may fall at any time. The district on the far side of the railway is largely deserted, says Mykola Tereshchenko, an assistant mayor in the town, who adds that around 40 to 50 people a day are asking to be evacuated further west. And then we go on to read, Russian bombs are striking with increasing frequency in the exposed eastern district of Konstantinovka. 3 women were killed and several wounded when a so-called invincibility shelter for people fleeing the fighting was struck around midnight on 24th March. One of the wounded, Igor Andreev, 52, his face covered in bruises, is still being treated in the town's hospital. Confidence is draining from Konstantinovka, and many of its shops and buildings are boarded up, even those that are still functioning. And so it looks as if people in the area close to Bakhmut are making up their own minds. They expect Bakhmut will fall soon, and we see that the Russians are able to shell Konstantinovka as well as Chasov Yar, and the people in Konstantinovka are sensing that the battle is soon going to reach them. Even as the fighting in Bakhmut continues, and by the way, there was another report, this is from a Russian source, which predicted that with the Wagner organization gaining ground in Bakhmut, in the center of Bakhmut, there would be a significant breakthrough in Bakhmut by the Wagner forces over the course of next week. Well, we'll see. Anyway, even as the fighting in Bakhmut continues, there are contradictory reports from Avdiivka. One report from a Ukrainian source suggested that the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back a short distance near a place called Voidanoye. Another report, completely different report, said on the contrary, this is another Ukrainian report I should say, said on the contrary that Russian forces around Avdiivka are increasing in size and power, especially to the north of Avdiivka, and this report suggests a serious crisis for Ukraine there. I also saw another report earlier, I think this was from a Russian source, that claimed that Russian forces from a village called Opitnoye to the south of Bakhmut, to the south of Avdiivka, are pushing northward towards Avdiivka, which would appear to contradict that first Ukrainian report that I spoke about. Let me reiterate again, I am not on location in any of these places. Inevitably, there's a lot of fog of war. The one thing that everybody agrees about is that Avdiivka has been pretty much destroyed as a town. Most of the buildings have now been shelled or blasted by Russian artillery and Russian bombing. And as I said, the city itself, the town, is essentially a ghost town. And for what it's worth, even if the Ukrainians are making occasional gains in the fighting around Avdiivka, even if they are able to push the Russians back in one place or another for a day or so, the direction of the fighting is clear and the Russians are still very much holding the initiative there. So that's Avdiivka at the moment. And going back to that Guardian report, it had a fair amount to say about the Ukrainian counteroffensive that we've been hearing quite a lot about. It mentioned the fact that the Ukrainians are complaining, Ukrainian soldiers are complaining that they haven't seen any of the Western equipment that they've been promised, that they're still operating their old T-64 tanks, some of which go back to the 1960s. I have to stress again that this is a bit of a red herring issue. The largest number of Western tanks that Ukraine is going to get, the single biggest block of Western tanks that are heading towards Ukraine, are not Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, and M1 Abrams tanks. They are Leopard 1s, German Leopard 1 tanks, mainly built in the 1960s with relatively thin armour and a 105mm rifled gun. They are not more advanced than the T-64s. The Ukrainians have been operating since before the war began. They are less advanced, in some respects at least, than those T-64s that the Ukrainians still have. Anyway, this Guardian report said that Ukraine has a total of around 900 tanks, which I suspect is probably true if we combine the 500 T-64s that Ukraine probably, or by some reports still has, with the various deliveries of tanks in the West that it has been receiving since mid-summer of last year. Most of which, by the way, as was correctly pointed out by Brian Beletic, continue to be Soviet-era T-72s or relatively new build, modified T-72s built in Poland. So, just saying. But anyway, 900 Ukrainian tanks against, at the very least, 1,800 Russian tanks, but with some Ukrainian soldiers confirming what Putin said the other day, that the Russians have at least a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers of tanks deployed on the battlefields. And I am confident that this is a 3-to-1 advantage, which does not include the T-62s and possibly T-55s, which have been so much talked about and which the Russians themselves have said